So welcome to this first Geneva Trade and Development Workshop, known affectionately around Lake Geneva as GTDW. The workshop is a great example of collaboration. We started it in 2008 as an in-person seminar with all the trade people around the lake. And this year we are going hybrid. It's jointly organized by the CEPR, Geneva School of Economics and Management, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, UNCTAD, and WTO. This is an example of one of a series of seminars that CEPR is helping host. This is the one on trade. The co-hosts here today, as you can see them, are Julia Kaya Grossi, Celine Carrera, Monica Mazrova, Marcelo Arlariega, and Frederic Robert-Nicot. We're extremely pleased to have Nina Pavcnik, professor at Dartmouth, as our inaugural speaker. Next week, at the same time, we'll have Paul Antras, and it just keeps on going like that. One great speaker, one great paper. You can see the full list at gtw.ch. And if you do tweet, be sure to tweet with the hashtag GTDW to sort of spread the word. And I would encourage you maybe to ask your graduate students to follow some of these papers, especially PhD students, to see how professors actually do this, spread the love, so to speak. Now the ground rules. We are leveraging the technology to ensure the presentation is both interactive and more orderly than the Trump-Biden debate was. Nina will have 60 minutes to present her paper, followed by 15 minutes of open question. And during the presentation, she will pause briefly after slide 8 and slide 20 to take comments and respond to questions. Now, all your questions will come to us through Q&A during this time. And if you have a burning clarifying question, please send it into Q&A, and the co-hosts will filter it through. And if it's appropriate and serves the war effort, we will pass it on to Nina and she can clarify it right away. Otherwise, we'll save it for the in-betweens. Now, when the presentation is done, we'll switch into a different mode where you will be asking questions by raising your hands. This will go on for 15 minutes. And I'll see where you've raised your hands. I'll call out your name, ask you to unmute, and then you talk directly with Nina and she'll react. So it's sort of more classic seminar things. So after the end of this whole thing, I'm just going to say thank you very much. We're going to end it and move on. So I want to go straight to you, Nina, to give you the floor. 60 minutes. You're talking about foreign direct investment and domestic firms, if I've got that right, but I'll let you introduce the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here. Let me share my screen. Can everybody see my slides? Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here. I'm grateful that this is the inaugural seminar, and thank you for joining us. This is joint work with Brian McCaig and Foong Wong, and Brian is actually also in the audience, and he can also answer your questions. Let me start with why we started with motivating this paper. So as you all know, developing countries have recently become very integrated into the global markets. And part of this integration has happened because of the remarkable growth in FDI, primarily with Greenfield. And since basically in the last 15 years, it is really the developing countries that have received majority of the global inflows of FDI, which has a lot of implications for how they can benefit in terms of technological transfers, productivity, and job creation. The other thing that's a little bit different about developing countries relative to developed country world is that in developing countries, recent literature has noted large degree of misallocation of resources across firms or industries. In part, this misallocation happens because of politically connected firms, and perhaps one of the most politically connected firms are state-owned enterprises, And these firms might receive, for example, cheaper credit, access to land that other people cannot, firms cannot receive, or also face softer budget constraints. So in this world, we believe that more evidence is needed in how trade policy interacts directly with foreign firms as well as other firm types such as SOE, and the reasons for those are twofold. There's now a large literature that has actually shown that when you have misallocation, it's actually not so clear how trade reforms affect allocation of employment, capital, market share, and productivity. And there's work by Atking and Kondawal summarizing these papers, or for example, a very recent paper by Bai Yin and Lu. The other aspect of the literature where we believe more evidence is needed is that there's actually an ongoing debate on how responsive value-added trade is, or fragmented production, or FDI is to trade agreements. And there's an ongoing literature there that started, almost 20 years ago, but has not reached consensus. For example, papers like Feinberg and Keene find that FDI actually doesn't appear, at least on the extensive margin, to be that reactive to trade policy changes, whereas Johnson and Noguera actually find quite a bit of responsiveness. So what do we do in our paper? Well, we investigate how what's the effect of lower tariffs on exports, in our particular case, instigated by the 2001 US-Vietnam trade agreement, how those lower tariffs affect firm performance in low-income country Vietnam. I'm going to talk about the agreement later on in detail, but let me just mention here is that this agreement was initiated in 2001, and it led to a very large positive export demand shock for Vietnamese firms. And the main thing to keep in mind here is that the main policy change that was kind of industry specific was decline in US tariffs on Vietnamese exports. So do keep that in mind, and I'll provide more details later. We make three contributions to the literature. So the first contribution is that we examine the role of competition from foreign firms relative to private domestic firms. We believe that this distinction is particularly important in low-income countries like Vietnam, where there was a large state sector. And because of this large state sector, the private domestic firms might actually, that are not as politically connected, might actually be credit constraints and face other barriers to expansion. And it's interesting to see is how important the competition from FIEs is in this process. In this exercise, another nice feature of our paper is that we observe all firm types, so foreign, private domestic, and SOEs, regardless of how large they are in the registered sector. There's a large literature that has examined kind of the role of an interaction of SOEs and domestic firms. That's kind of summarized in this figure. However, a large share of this literature only focuses on large firms or only focuses on two firm types. So the way we contribute is we contribute to the literature by focusing on all three firm types as well as all firms. And just to give you an example, if we focus just on firms that export, we would only be, in the case of Vietnam, capturing up to 70% of revenue and employment, even in the registered sector. And we want to see how much that matters. The second contribution that we make is that we focus on long-term impact of a large one-time trade policy change on firms. Why do we think this is important? Well, I think looking at the long-term view matters for two reasons. First of all, earlier work by Dix, Carnero, and Kovac has shown that there's pretty large delay in adjustment of capital, which also interacts with labor markets. So that's one reason why we're taking a long-run view. And the other reason is that when you have a lot of SOEs, the government subsidies might actually increase their survival rate. So again, it's useful to kind of follow them over a longer period of time to examine how trade policy has potentially influenced them. The third contribution that we make is that we're going to be studying cumulative effect of the trade policy on incumbents as well as entering and exiting firms of all these firm types. And we do so in a setting where there is a large FIE entry and sizable SOE decline. So to give you a sense, this figure shows the employment in registered manufacturing sector in Vietnam, where you see that from 2000, the increase in employment in foreign invested firms went from about 22% of employment in 2000 to almost 60% by 2017. At the same time, there was a large decline of state-owned firms. In terms of employment, their employment share in registered sector decreased from about 45% in 2000 to only 3% in 2017. While private domestic firms, which are noted in the green here, also grew during this time period to about, by 2017, accounting for about 40% of employment growth. So we feel that this is an interesting case to examine, how much has trade policy led to these patterns that I've shown you. One thing that I want to mention here is, the existing literature has examined the interaction between SOEs and private firms, but oftentimes those interactions are observed during a time period where SOE share in employment is already small. So what this graph shows you here is like some sampling of existing studies that have looked at the role of SOEs. You can see that when they're in the time period they're examining SOEs, their share of SOEs in employment is actually substantially, it's lower already, like at 15%, or for example, or at most like 25%. In our particular case, we actually, even though we don't observe the world where SOE is accounted for, majority of employment, we actually can observe them over a long period of time. And through that, we hope that we can actually shed further light on the process through which they adjust to trade policy change. So what's the related, what literature do we contribute to? Well, there's a large literature that examines the effect of FDI on developing countries. Most of these studies have focused on the role of FDI for spillovers, both horizontal and vertical, on domestic firms. There's a lot of nice, exciting work on that topic. There's also emerging literature that focuses on the effects of reallocation and competition from SOEs. That's one literature we contribute to. The next one is that in this, clearly FDI entry and acquisition decisions are exogenous. And recently people have examined how much of the kind of productivity advantages or entry decisions of FDI are driven by selection, and what other factors affect the entry decision. And for example, financial constraints are a factor that the literature has examined. And also there's a literature that examines how trade policy has affected FDI entry, ranging from, or like policy more general. There's a literature on the role of bilateral tax treaties, and then a literature on FDI entry and trade agreements. As I mentioned earlier, this literature finds mixed findings on the responsiveness of FDI to these trade agreements. But what's also important in this literature is that taking into account the heterogeneity of trade policy, especially in the world of global supply chain, as, for example, work of Emily Blanchard and her co-authors has shown. That's one literature we contribute. There's another literature that focusing on firm performance in the presence of politically connected firms and examines how trade affects the interaction. That's another literature we contribute to. So before I move on and kind of show you what we actually do, I can take questions. There are any questions?
Let me unmute
Richard.
myself. So let me just, Laszlo has helper and says, do you know if an FIE is an SOE?
That's a good, I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So if you give me a minute, most of them in Vietnam, actually, even at the beginning of our sample in manufacturing, 75% were wholly foreign owned. So the answer is, in the case of Vietnam, not really, yeah.
Okay. So I think you've been extremely clear, Nina. So just carry on. No questions to report.
Yeah, so I'm going to go to, first I'm going to talk about the background on the bilateral trade agreement. Then I'm going to very briefly talk about the conceptual framework we have in mind, then data and empirical results. So let me start off with giving you some of the key details of the US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement and how we, and highlight the features that we use in our empirical work. So after US-Vietnam war, US imposed the trade embargo on Vietnam until '94. So there was very little, basically the trade between Vietnam and US was non-existent. However, when the embargo was lifted, Vietnamese exports were still subject to really high levels of protection because they were subject to column 2 tariffs in the US tariff schedule as a communist country. What the agreement in 2001 did is basically it reclassified Vietnam from one existing tariff schedule, so this was column 2 schedule, to another one, which was the most favored nation or normal relations tariff schedule, which are the tariffs that United States negotiated with WTO members in various stages of WTO negotiations. So basically, the nice feature of this agreement from the empirical perspective is that basically tariff cuts are due from the switch from one pre-existing to another pre-existing tariff schedule. I want to also mention is that by the time of the trade agreement in 2001, Vietnam already applied MFN tariffs on US exports coming to Vietnam. So that really kind of the major policy change of the agreement in 2001 was the decline in export tariffs that US firms exporting to, that Vietnamese firms exporting to US faced. The tariff cuts were pretty large and varied across industries. So on average in manufacturing, they dropped by 29 percentage points. And they also, you see that standard deviation was pretty large. In the graph, the industries at the 2-digit level are sorted by the size of the employment from like the largest, such as footwear, to the smallest. And you see that there's quite a bit of variation in their tariff cuts. From the empirical perspective, we believe that these tariff changes are less likely to suffer from the the usual concerns about political economy of tariff changes, because they were driven by this shift in between two pre-existing tariff schedules. And those schedules, were either determined or negotiated like way before Vietnam started growing pretty fast. Nonetheless, we still worry that that kind of industry-specific changes in tariffs that are now faced by Vietnamese exports to U.S. might still be, for spurious, reasons, correlated with, for example, kind of industry or industry characteristics in Vietnam. So in our earlier work, Brian and I did quite a bit of checks showing that these tariff cuts are not correlated with contemporaneous export demand or supply shocks facing Vietnam, or kind of pre-existing trends, industry-specific trends. For example, what we have done there is we show that these tariff changes predict changes in export growth to US, but they do not actually predict export growth to another high-income country, trade bloc such as EU, nor are they related to kind of pre-existing trade patterns in these two trade partners. In the current work, we also, because we are focusing on different types of firms, we also showed that initial ownership employment shares are not correlated with the in an industry, are not correlated with the industry-specific tariff cuts. The other thing that I want to mention, this is related to the question that Laszlo asked before, is the BTA did not have industry-specific policies for FDI. Just to give you a bit of a background there, the main commitment that BTA included was that Vietnam would open market access for US FDI in general, but more specifically on services. And in the current paper, we are not actually focusing on services, we are focusing on manufacturing. And in part, the focus was on services because by the time of the agreement, Vietnam was already relatively open to FDI in manufacturing. No there was a law passed governing foreign investment in '96. At that time, no manufacturing industries required special approval for an investment entry license. And there were very few restricted sectors, such as tobacco, sugar and alcohol, chemical and pharmaceuticals within manufacturing. However, BTA was viewed as a stepping stone to Vietnam's entry to WTO. So it did include this commitment to eliminate, just in general, kind of government screening of FDI, removal of kind of all trade-related investment measures that were inconsistent with WTO. And a lot of this was accomplished by the 2006 Unified Investment Law that basically covered all registered enterprises. However, what I want to mention is that government interference in manufacturing FDI was actually not as large, even in 2000. As I mentioned before, 77% of manufacturing FDI was already in kind of wholly owned foreign firms. By 2017, 95% of manufacturing FDI was kind of in wholly owned ones, as opposed to kind of joint ventures. So if there are no questions about BTA, let me move on to conceptual framework. This is going to be a very brief section. I just want to kind of give you a sense of how to think about how these reductions on Vietnamese in tariffs on Vietnamese exports to US would affect different types of firms. So if we just think of like the typical Mellitz framework with productivity differing across firms, reduction in variable export costs due to BTA is going to be predicting expansion of the most productive incumbents, and then contraction and or exit of the least productive firms. So that, and through this reallocation process and selection process, industry productivity would rise. However, in our setting, there's a lot of reasons to believe is that firms actually we might have kind of firm specific or firm type specific barriers to reallocation or entry and exit. There's a lot of evidence that Vietnamese SOEs received quite a bit of preferential access to inputs. And in that sort of setting, the existing literature that has amended Mellitz-style models to account for this sort of misallocations has shown that how these export cost reductions will be affecting reallocation doesn't just depend on productivity, but also on distortions. In particular, it could be that lower productivity firms could continue to produce and even perhaps expand if they actually still have a high subsidy. Likewise, high productivity firms might not expand or could potentially even exit if they don't have a subsidy. So that kind of the overall impact on reallocation of resources and on productivity could potentially even be negative, as kind of recent work by Bai, Jin, and Lu has shown. And to give you a sense of what sort of barriers of different types of firms that we are examining might be facing in Vietnam, we have some additional data from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, which we don't use in the remainder of the work. But we use these surveys just to illustrate how self-reported obstacles differ across FDI firms, foreign firms, state firms, and private domestic firms. So for example, foreign firms are much more likely to report that international markets are their main markets. Almost like 60% of them report so, as opposed to only 24% of state firms and 21% of private firms. And the other thing that I really want to draw your attention to is, for example, 65% of foreign firms say that finance is not an obstacle to their operation, whereas 30% of state firms say that, and 40% of private domestic firms say that. So this just, what we want to use this to illustrate is that these three firm types that we are going to be focusing on do appear to face different barriers that will be affecting potentially reallocation of resources across them. And what our work, what our paper tries to do is shed empirical light on how this reallocation actually happens. Let me talk about data before I show you the empirical results. So the data we will be using are annual enterprise surveys from 2000 to 2017. So these are surveys that include all Vietnamese businesses that are registered as an enterprise. And who has to register? So if you're a state firm, if you're a foreign firm, you have to register to legally operate. Private firms private domestic firms in Vietnam only have to register if they have more than 10 workers. However, what I want to highlight is even though you don't have to register if you don't have more than 10 workers, many firms choose to register even with below that cutoff. And this is the difference between our paper and some of the existing work, is because a lot of the existing papers that focus on SOEs versus domestic firms, they focus on exporters or large firms, whereas here we really have like all registered firms. It's a panel data where each firm receives unique firm ID. So we observe actually entrants. Through that, we can figure out who is an entrant, who exits, and who is a continuing firm. Going back to the question that that was asked before about the relationship between SOEs and foreign firms. If an SOE gets privatized, we can actually observe that in the data, because it's a firm unique ID actually doesn't change. And likewise, if a foreign firm would take over an SOE, we would be able to observe that. Because most of the foreign firms just enter as wholly owned into manufacturing, we actually don't observe many of those transitions. What's a little bit more likely to observe is that an SOE was privatized and became private domestic firms. But even that is actually not as large of a share as like SOE exit. As I mentioned, we observed the three firm ownership types. There are more ownerships, but we kind of group them into state-owned, foreign invested, and private domestic ones. And here also we kind of deviate from from most of the existing literature, which usually just focuses on, with a few exceptions, just focuses on two firm types. But we'll show you that distinguishing between private, foreign, and domestic firms is going to be quite important here. Oops. And just to give you a sense, we have about a little bit over 180,000 unique firms that we're going to be observing over, around like 130 four-digit industries. Let me give you a few descriptive statistics before I give you the results. So what this graph shows is basically it draws distribution of TFP in private firms. That's the green graph. State firms, that's the red graph, and the foreign firms, that's the blue one. And you see that foreign firms are more productive than state and private firms as measured by revenue TFP. There's also a lot of entry and exit of firms in our data. So if we just take kind of the beginning and the end of our sample, 75% of firms that were operating in 2000 exited by 2017. These exiters actually accounted for about like 40% of revenue and 46% of employment in 2000. So you see that there's a lot of churning. The other thing that's really striking is that 97% of firms that are operating in 2017 were not operating in 2000. And these entrants account for about 83% of revenue and 84% of employment in 2017. So this just kind of highlights why it's like so important to examine kind of all registered firms and kind of potentially take a longer term view of how the industries in Vietnam are evolving in response to trade policy change. However, what's interesting is that, if we would be looking at the typical heterogeneous firm model, they would predict similar entry and exit rates across different types of firms, because usually the assumption is that they face similar entry barriers. In Vietnam, we actually observe pretty large differences in entry and exit rates across the three firm types. And in particular, you see that exit rates are pretty similar for SOEs and foreign investment firms, but much higher for private domestic firms. They have about like 80%, 80% of firms that were active in 2000 are no longer active in 2017 in private domestic firms, but only about like 46 or 49% are for SOEs and foreign firms. And there's also big difference in entry rates, with entry rates being the lowest for SOEs and then pretty high for foreign invested firms and private domestic enterprises. So this, I guess, again suggests that there might be differences in firm type level barriers that affect entry and exit choices. And again, kind of motivates why we look at these different types of firms. I'm going to now move to empirical results, unless there are questions from the audience.
So I can ask a couple questions. You got a couple questions here. Mm-hmm. So first of all, it's coming from Marcelo. Foreign invested enterprises. You mentioned about employment shares, but what's going on with the employment levels? And let me just give you a somewhat related question to that, coming from Frederic Robert-Nicot, which is, do you have information about the evolution of informal work? And
yes, so
then let me just give you, so that's the two jobs questions, and let me give you a couple of entry questions coming from Julia. So can you figure out the relationship between the new foreign firms and pre-existing multinationals in Vietnam? For example, maybe a multinational that's already there buys a local supplier.
Mm-hmm. Very good, all very good questions. So this graph that I was talking about shares, in the slides, but the graph that I've shown you actually shows levels of employment in registered manufacturing, and you see, that here that the level of employment increased tremendously for foreign firms as well as private domestic firms, whereas you see that, like in absolute value, the employment in manufacturing and state firms is actually decreasing. So these are actually levels, and and the shares, we have it. If you want to see all, kind of year by year, I can show them to you here. You see that the share of employment in foreign firms is increasing. It's decreasing from 45% to 3% in state firms, and the remaining bit is private firms. As I go back, a good question is, the question about informal work is really important. And, in part, the reason why we are looking at this, we are doing this paper is that Brian and I have an earlier paper that actually was examining exactly the question: how much did these new export opportunities affect reallocation of labor from informal to formal sector? Because at the beginning of 2000. About 62% of employment in manufacturing was in informal sector. What we actually found there is that the BTA contributed to the reallocation of workers from informal to formal work. But what we found is that a lot of that reallocation did not happen because informal firms were transitioning to the formal sector, but it was basically workers moving into the existing or new entrants into the formal work. So what we wanted to, given that in the formal sector, so what we wanted to do, part of the reason why we wanted to do this second paper is kind of try to understand more what's driving this growth of the formal sector that's in part contributing to the relative decline of the informal sector. So during this time period, informal sector is declining, but in part, but that's mostly happening because workers are transitioning or entering directly the formal sector. And what we are looking in the current paper is checking like how, which firms within the formal sector or so-called register sector are accounting for that. Can you repeat the question that Julia had?
Sure. It's about a definition of foreign entry. Worrying about the foreign entry is really just a pre-existing multinational buying a local supplier.
So pre-existing multinational within Vietnam or from somewhere else? Yes, yeah. So we unfortunately, we don't know kind of the information about the parent of the multinational, like somewhere else. I would imagine, and I'll show you some, these foreign firms are entering at like, a fairly large size, like about like 200 people. So I while I can't show you that, my sense would be that these are subsidiaries of existing multinationals. So in that sense, I think, Julia, kind of the point that you're bringing up is that maybe the entry of these foreign firms is very different from the entry of the domestic firms, because they, it's basically an opening of a subsidiary as opposed to opening of an entirely new firms. And that might actually kind of help explain why some of the effects of FDI entry are so persistent and robust. But they also kind of point out to the fact that, especially when you are in a world where some of the larger domestic firms are politically connected, maybe you need this sort of foreign entry where these firms are already tied into an existing production structure, or don't face as large financial constraints to be able to compete in the markets that are distorted. But I'll show you some more results on that. But I do think that like part of the reason why FDI entry is so robust is because this is not, it's tied to a subsidiary. They are subsidiaries of larger multinationals. We wish we had that data, but
right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Also, your co-author, Brian, has been busy answering many online questions. So now please just continue on. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. So let me talk about the empirical approach we take. Just as a reminder, what we are trying to do here is estimate the effect of these reductions in export tariffs on exports facing firms from Vietnam in US on different firm types. And we're going to be relying on variation on tariff cuts across 127 industries, and also examine their evolution over time. So I will show you a lot of results in graphical form, but the main form that all of these regressions will take is the following. So we're going to have an outcome of interest in industry J at time t that will be regressed on the change in tariff facing this industry in US, in industry J. And we're going to allow this, since this was like a one-time tariff change, what we're going to do is we're going to be kind of, the base year is going to be 2001, so the beginning of the agreement, but then we're going to be examining the cumulative effect of these tariff changes, and that's going to be captured by this coefficient beta t that's going to be allowed to vary by time. So we're going to be basically, what beta t is going to do is going to be examining how much did this tariff change in industry J affect an outcome in this industry by time t. So this is going to, we're going to be looking at the cumulative effect relative to 2000. We're also going to control for industry fixed effects, time effects, and then we're going to have a slew of industry time specific controls accounting for other trade policy changes, industry trends, and so on. The one thing that I want to mention is that because we have because of the data that we have a fairly short the biggest challenge is that we have a short pre-BTA period due to that data limitation. So the only place where we can kind of really show you a longer evidence that there are no pre-existing trends is actually looking at trade data. So what we first do is we basically want to show you that this trade agreement actually had a sizable effect on trade between Vietnam and United States by running the regression that I've just showed you with imports from Vietnam, exports from Vietnam to US, or imports from Vietnam to US as the dependent variable, which is on your y-axis. And then the x-axis basically shows you the coefficient beta t kind of estimated year by year, and again, it should be interpreted relative to 2001, and that this gives us the effects of the BTA on US imports. And what you can see is that there was no kind of pre-existing trend in these imports. However, after the trade agreement is implemented, tariffs, the exports to United States from Vietnam increase substantially. now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually show you a whole bunch of other results that look at kind of more industry or firm specific outcomes. For the sake of time, I'm not going to actually show you industry specific results. I'm just going to summarize them. So the first thing we wanted to check is, like, do Vietnamese industries subject to larger US tariff reductions expand the way kind of neoclassical trade models would suggest? And in fact, they do. We observed that industries with that experience larger tariff cuts expanded employment, firm counts, and revenues. Okay, and what usually happens is that there's quite a bit of kind of cumulative growth that happens in the first 5 to 6 years after BTA, after which kind of accumulation slows down. But it continues to rise for firm count and employment, but kind of levels off for revenue. So this is all consistent with kind of typical predictions of the neoclassical trade models. Resources are moving toward industries experiencing larger reductions in variable export costs. What's more interesting to us is, like, how do firm types in these industries adjust? So what we do is, like, we basically estimate a version of the equation that I've just shown you, but rather than having industry time as the unit observation, we have industry firm type. So, foreign firm, SOEs, or private domestic firms as unit of observations. And in addition to the controls that I've talked to you about, we also include industry firm type effects, and also firm type time trends. Okay, and again, these coefficients beta measure the cumulative effect of BTA on the outcome of interest. So we do this for employment, firm count, and revenue. Let me just show you results for employment. So what we find is that industries with larger tariff cuts experience expansion of foreign and private firms and contraction of state firms. So what you see here is that we have the leftmost graph focuses on log employment in FIEs, and you see that that's increasing over time. The middle graph shows you the effects of tariffs on log employment in SOEs. You also see that initially, there's some increase, but not as much, but then it increases over time. However, what I want to emphasize here is SOEs employment is declining during this period. So what this graph really shows us is that there's smaller contraction of employment in state firms in industries that experience larger tariff cuts. So keep that in mind. And then on the right-hand side, you see we observe that there are increases in employment in private firms, but the effects there are noisier and more muted than in the FDI employment. So what we want to do now is, we see that, like, industry level results are in general in line with traditional trade theory. It seems that it's important to account for firm type, because the industry level expansion is predominantly driven by foreign over private or state firm expansion. And it's also kind of sustained over time. What we want to do now is kind of look within each of the industries and examine how is employment share reallocating across firm types within industries. So what we're going to do from now on is we're going to be splitting firms into continuing firms, entrants, and those that exit, and examining how employment shares are evolving across those firm types in response to tariff cuts. So what this graph here does is, again, reports coefficient beta for continuing firms in green, for exiting firms in blue, and for entrants in red, all relative to 2001. And what you see here is that tariff cuts result in expansion of entrants. So the coefficients on entrants are always positive and significant. But it leads to decline in employment share of continuing firms in green, and in decline in of employment share due to exit. this entry response is actually particularly pronounced. And this is actually kind of counter to the typical prediction of the Mallet-Stein models, which would suggest actually that it's continuers that should be continuing firms that should be responding most to the lower tariffs. This just adds standard errors to it, so I'm going to skip it. So what we want to do now is we want to actually check, like within each of the industries, is this employment share mostly driven by foreign firms, private firms, or state firms' responses to tariff cuts. So what we do now is we basically, separate the effects within industries. Look at the kind of market share within industries for foreign firms, state firms in red, and private firms in green. And what you see here is, again, that the effects of the BTA are positive for foreign firms, which suggests that tariff cuts result in increased employment share of foreign firms. They actually result in reduced employment share within industry of private firms, which are in green, and basically kind of no change in employment share of state firms. So that now suggests, that these differential responses across continuing firms, entrants, and exits, as well as the three firm types, state, private, and foreign within industries. So what we want to do now is we basically look at each firm type by and their entering, exiting, and continuing patterns. So what do we get there? So we first look at the effects of BTA tariff cuts of employment shares of foreign firms. So here what we do is we basically split this increased employment share in response to tariff cuts by foreign firms into the role of entrants, that's the red line, role of exiters, that's the blue line, and the role of continuing foreign firms. So these are firms that were present in 2001 and continue to be present. And what you see is that the vast majority of the expanded employment share of foreign firms is driven by foreign firm entry. And foreign firm entry is basically driving overall employment growth of entrants overall, and also kind of growth in foreign firms that we see in this graph. While notice that here that foreign incumbents, so their effects are denoted by the green line, are actually are observing decline in their employment share, and as are exiters. But the exiting part is kind of what we would expect. This is just giving standard errors to it. What about SOEs? So what's interesting is that tariff cuts lower state entrant employment share. So entry actually negatively contributes to employment growth in SOEs, whereas entry, and that basically happens is because there's just less entry into industries with larger tariff cuts. Entry is actually higher into industries with lower tariff cuts. Okay. Likewise, you notice that actually the effect of exit of SOEs has basically exit has a positive effect on employment of employment share of SOEs, which is again a little bit counterintuitive. But all this is saying is that exiting firms are exiting industries with higher tariff cuts at a lower rate, and this is again kind of counter to the benchmark model prediction. Because if everything would be allocated efficiently prior to the reform, we would expect opposite results. But this is basically showing that basically kind of the presence of SOEs is kind of stalling the usual entry and exit reallocation process. Okay. Finally, let's look at what's happening in the private domestic firms. What we see here is we do see what we would expect. We observe decrease in employment share due to exit. That's the blue line. We also see increase in market share due to entry of private domestic firms. But these effects, if you kind of look over time, it really kind of diminishes and actually becomes negative. So the thing that I want to emphasize here is relative to the responses we observed in the foreign sector, the private domestic sector has much more muted responses in terms of magnitudes. And while entry contributes to the employment market share initially, its effects actually decrease over time. So to kind of summarize all this, the table here basically shows the effects of BTA tariff cuts on employment shares by firm status, by basically just showing you the 2017 coefficient relative to 2001. And as I mentioned, the employment growth is mainly driven by foreign firms, as you see in the top line. Private domestic firms actually are worse off. But what's actually, and you see that, like, how important the entry of foreign firms is, whereas continuing firms actually don't contribute it much. The other thing that really matters here is that with less entry and exits, state firms actually stalled the reallocation process in high-cut industries through exits. And the final thing is that, BTA tariff cuts at the initial stages actually have kind of the expected effects on private firms, but the cumulative effects of private firms, of the tariff cuts on private firms, really kind of diminish over time. So what I want to do in the last 10 minutes, I just want to focus on, on the entry margin, and want to understand how much of this important effect that the trade agreement has on entry of and employment in the entrants, especially in the foreign sector, has to do with initially larger size of foreign entrants versus subsequent growth in foreign entrants. So before I do that, let me actually, Richard, would it be helpful to answer any questions, or should I just kind of move on to the remaining results?
We do have a few questions, so let me put those in, and they're lingering from a little bit earlier on, since I haven't completely mastered the technology. So the first one, Marcelo asked, the export opportunities may exacerbate misallocation due to pre-existing domestic distortions, even if firm productivity goes up and export goes up. Is this a concern for you here?
Yeah, so I think that's in part why we are doing this exercise, because we believe that that there might be these misallocations that differ across these three firm types, and we want to kind of see, what we wanted to see is, like, how much do we actually observe reallocation in response to trade policy by these three firm types. I think it would be. I think what we can't do is we can't kind of really disentangle the role of misallocation from the effect of role of productivity, unless we would impose a lot of assumptions on the theory model. And we could, in principle, we could do a quantitative exercise where we basically kind of assume different correlation between misallocation and productivity. But what we thought to do is, like, let's first just see what happens in the data, and because that's going to give us a sense of, like, which firms are expanding and which ones are not, or are maybe contracting slower than we would expect them to. But I think the only way we could kind of disentangle this misallocation productivity is by using a quantitative model. So next.
Then let me very quickly ask a question of my own, and that is, sometimes the story is that a sector dominated by state-owned enterprises is one that's ripe for productivity improvements and expansion. And I see you have sector dummies, but did you look at, for example, the sectors where state-owned enterprises were dominant before the BTA, and did they act differently?
Yeah, so actually the direct response to your point is, like, we actually, one thing that, like, is on our to-do list, we actually want to check whether or not these adjustments differ, like, basically take let's take, like, one metric of how much misallocation there is, like, let's look at, like, prevalence of state-owned enterprises and employment, like, at the beginning of our sample, right? And use that as some sort of metric of, like, misallocation, okay? And then what we can do is, by interacting that with our tariff change variable, we could actually check whether or not these sectors adjust slowly. I think that's a very good thing to do, that we planned to do. I do want to mention, though, is we do include those initial shares of sectors are actually not correlated with the industry-specific or sectoral-specific tariff shocks, which is useful for kind of the legitimacy of the empirical exercise I'm showing you now. And the other thing that actually really mattered is it was important to account for just SOE specific time trends in the empirical analysis, because this is a time during which Vietnamese government is definitely letting SOEs decline. And if we don't actually take those kind of secular trends into account, we would potentially attribute more of the decline to the trade policy change. But we actually control for that with the time shocks. Yeah.
Carry on, please.
Okay, so let me give you a sense of how much like what I want to show you here is, before I show you any regression results, just show you what is the size of entering firms and how much do entering firms grow subsequent to entry. So what this graph does, and we've done this for many years, let's take a 2001 entry cohort for foreign firms initially. And the starting point basically shows you that they were, they had about like 180 workers on average when they entered. And what we do then is basically we track this 2001 cohort and check how much it grow, like of those that survive. The blue line gives you the initial employment of like the initial mean employment at the time of entry in the surviving firms each year. So for example, 2009, the blue line here gives you the mean entry employment of firms that enter in 2001 and survived until 2009. The red line shows you, what's the contemporary employment in 2009 for those firms that enter in 2001 and survived by 2009. And what you can see here is that foreign entrants are pretty large when they enter, and they grow by a factor of, I believe, by a factor of more than 4 by 2017. So there's, so they enter large, kind of going back to kind of Julia's question that she had before, but they also grow subsequently a lot. Let me now show you the same graph for private domestic entrants. And what you see here is that these are private domestic entrants that entered in 2001. And then we follow what their average size is, average initial size is for those that survive, for let's say by 2009, and what their contemporary employment size is by 2009. And what you see here is that private entrants enter smaller, and this could be because these are actually new firms as opposed to a subsidiary of an existing multinational, but they also grow substantially less than foreign firms. Basically by a factor of they grow by a factor of less than 2 by 2017. What I want to mention though is that these patterns these differences between foreign and domestic private firms are not just driven by the smaller private firm size. So what we do here is we basically say, well, let's look at like maybe what's better to compare is let's compare entry of domestic firms that are large, that enter larger to begin with. So we focus on firms that entered with 50 or more employees, and you see that there the entrant size is actually much more similar to the entrant size of foreign firms. Like in foreign firms, I think it was around 180. Here, it's a little bit over 160. But even here, even if we just focus on the domestic private firms, you see that their subsequent growth is substantially smaller than the subsequent growth of foreign firms. Okay, if we look at state firms that enter in 2001, you see again they actually enter really large. They are more than double the average foreign entrant, but they actually don't really grow that much subsequently over time. In fact, they actually contract. So what this actually really kind of highlights is that not only do foreign firms enter larger than private domestic firms, but they also they actually have a lot of subsequent growth. And what we want to check next is we actually want to check, we want to try to decompose this, the effect of tariffs on employment share through foreign entry into the contribution of the initial entry size and the contribution of the subsequent growth. And what you see, and basically the left graph basically runs the regression where the market share of foreign entrants that is driven by their initial employment size is a dependent variable, whereas the right graph shows you the employment share based on subsequent growth. And what you see is that initially the effects of tariffs on increased employment share of foreign entrants is basically initially driven by entry size. Like, so basically these are like larger firms are entering and they're capturing their employment share in the industry. However, after a few years, you see that the subsequent growth of these foreign entrants is also contributing to the employment share, so that kind of by the end of the sample in 2017, half of the employment reallocation is due to the initial entry size, and half of it is to the subsequent growth. Okay, and this kind of highlights why it's potentially important to be looking at these like longer run adjustment effects, because if we would be just focusing on the few years right around the trade agreement, we would be missing that. So let me conclude this. So recall that kind of the main goal of the paper was to assess longer term effects of one-time trade policy reform on different firm types. We found that there are pretty important differences in the effects of trade policy on foreign and private domestic firms in a low-income country with a large state sector. We found that expansion was predominantly of firms and employment shares was predominantly driven by foreign firms over private domestic firms and state-owned enterprises. And private domestic firms actually do not see much of employment growth in response to export opportunities, whereas the foreign firms do. Okay. The other thing that our results highlight is the importance of studying the cumulative effects of trade shocks on incumbents, entry and exit by firm types, because we see that like over time, foreign entry drives overall reallocation, while state firms kind of stall this reallocation process through lower exit rates. Okay. However, the employment growth effects in foreign entrants really kind of take time to materialize in response to tariffs, because half of that response is actually driven by subsequent employment growth that only materializes, after 6 years of the agreement. The final thing that I want to mention, and I didn't have too much time to talk about it in the talk, is that we find that this complementarity for the case of Vietnam between FDI and exports. And this could be related to export platform FDI. Recall that the main industry-specific policy change was a tariff reduction in export destination, and that at the time of the trade agreement, Vietnam was already open to FDI. So really, it's really kind of this reduction in export industry-specific changes in tariffs that was the main policy change. We found that exports positively responded to tariff cuts, with the effects on overall exports to the world increasing over time. Okay, so the main effects were driven initially by kind of the increased exports to the United States, but then over time, like these effects expanded to with expanded exports to other countries. Okay, and FDI responses to tariff cuts kind of follow very similar cumulative patterns as exports. So in this particular case, because of that, they seem to be complementary to each other. So kind of the big takeaway from the paper is that, especially in a setting like Vietnam, when you have large state-owned enterprises, you have private domestic firms that might be facing barriers to expansion or to even entry, it's actually important to take into account all these different types of firms, including foreign firms, if you try to understand kind of short and longer term impacts of trade liberalization episodes. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Nina. We'll have to make you an honorary Swiss. You were so dead on time, given that we started 1 or 2 minutes late. Now, what we're doing is opening up the session to open Q&A, and I see Laszlo Halpern already has his hand up. So Laszlo, can you unmute yourself and then ask a question? No, unmute yourself.
Yes, I did it. Okay. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. And I have 2 questions. First one is that perhaps it might be interesting to investigate that the industrial effect of the tariff change and tariff reduction might be industry specific. So when you are specifying your equation, betas are not allowed to evolve differently across sectors.
Yes, I think, I mean, at some point, like you have to make, you only have so many degrees of freedom, right? We thought like what we wanted to highlight here is kind of more differences between firm types across within industries, right? But it could be the case that these responses would also differ across industries. There, like you then start running into kind of degrees of freedom issue. And I think, but one thing that we plan to do that would be kind of more industry specific would be kind of going back to the point, to the question that Richard posed before, are the effects different in industries where kind of SOE presence was high at the beginning, kind of at prior to the trade agreement, and less so, and see how those evolve. So that's something we plan to do. That would be, I guess, industry-specific effect, but tied to a particular industry characteristic. Do you have in mind like particular industries where you expect the effects to be different, beyond the SOEs presence?
I would certainly think of the potential for industry-specific differences. What is the overall impact or cumulative impact of the tariff reduction? So that's why, just as a exploration, it would be interesting to somehow interact to the industry and the BTA.
Yeah, so I can see that.
Nina, can I just jump in there and suggest one? Vietnam had a traditional comparative advantage that you could look at with a real comparative advantage, and it might be interesting to see whether it evolved differently where they had a revealed comparative advantage before the tariff agreement.
Yeah, and actually one thing we did do is because, for example, as you saw, like when I showed you the graph with tariff cuts, industries such as like footwear, apparel, and textiles are the ones where employment was larger to begin with, like related to their revealed comparative advantage. One thing we have done is we have kind of removed some of the kind of key industries, and of course the magnitude of the effect does change, which kind of speaks to the point that Laszlo is saying, that kind of what we are capturing here is the average effect as opposed to industry-specific effect. But the patterns we are observing are not driven by one particular kind of dominant industry, I would say. But I agree, like we could actually, like, the other thing, like, more, another thing that we could do is also kind of just, look, rather than removing a particular industry, kind of look at differential effect by revealed comparative advantage, yeah.
My second question is that it's important to somehow investigate also the extent of the processing trade, in the sense that if you have the data on the imports by firms, then it's interesting to see that how the importing precedes the exporting activity of the firm. Yeah. And then that would be a two-step procedure, and to be able to understand what's the contribution of the firm and how it is impacted by the increased importing, because you are now concentrating on the exports, right? And then it would be interesting to see that what's the relationship between imports and exports, and in the sense of processing trade as well.
Yeah, and I think that's again, very good point. Like I think a lot of these firms are, kind of going back to Julia's comment, are probably part of the supply chains, and we do know that also like FDI firms import more of their materials than others. The actual agreement didn't change that much. Tariffs, I think actually the one thing that we've been thinking about doing is like the place where the ease of importing materials might have changed, though again it's going to vary whether or not you are in a special processing zone, is with the WTO accessions, and so we've been like thinking about like, should we add that to the paper and kind of look at like how that shock to tariffs actually affects kind of access to cheaper imported inputs, and then how that affects exporting. But yeah, very well taken point.
So if somebody wants to raise their hand, oh yeah, here we go. Julia Sirman, please, Julia, unmute yourself.
Hello, thanks a lot. Thanks for this very interesting presentation. My question is if in the data you have any information on the country of origin of the international firms that are investing and or on which international markets they are targeting with their exports, if any?
Yeah, so actually we just, let me give you here. So this is what this graph here shows you is it gives you kind of foreign, like employment in foreign firms by the source of investment. From 2000 to 2016. We don't have the information on ownership like for every year, but what you see is that both at the beginning of our sample in 2000 and kind of the last year for which we have data in 2015, the main source of FDI is actually Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Interestingly, U.S. actually is not that large of an investor into Vietnam. And your second question was, yeah. Like what are the export destinations? So U.S. like so basically right after the agreement, United States very quickly over the span of like 2 or 3 years became I think the accounted for like 25% of manufacturing exports from Vietnam. Brian would know more kind of the detailed data sets. I'm not sure if you can, if he's muted or unmuted, but I think U.S. is a large destination. I think Europe was a pretty large destination. China over time becomes more, increasingly large destination, perhaps even one of the largest ones. But like I don't have those numbers right here.
Brian?
Yeah, the top 4 export markets are the U.S., at least within manufacturing, are the U.S. followed by the EU, and then Japan and China. So yeah, your estimate of it's about 25% of exports from manufacturing going to the U.S. within 3 years.
Very good. So somebody else wants to ask a question. Otherwise, I'll fill in the time with some questions. Mm-hmm. Nina, you have an interesting data set. And what I was interested in the evolution of the size distribution. And there, the traditional theory has some very strong implications of the evolution of the size distribution. And you were focusing very much on firm type. I understand why you did that. But it would also be interesting to see whether your data confirms over time the dogs get kicked out and the winners expand kind of twisted size distribution. Do you see that at all?
Yeah. So do you mean like by productivity or even just like the
size? Just sales is good.
Yeah. So where the biggest deviation from that is SOEs, right? Because you saw that like SOEs tend to be very large. The smaller SOEs are the ones that are exiting. The ones that are staying there continue to be large, but those are probably the ones that are the most misallocated. So I think some of the very inefficient firms probably still stay there because what we are finding, and this is another thing that we want to do is, while we don't observe, subsidies that these firms receive, we do actually observe in the data whether or not your SOE owned by a local government or by a state government, by a federal government or central government. So we expect that the ones that are owned by central government are the more connected ones, and those are the ones that are sticking around. And I would imagine that they are probably, they are potentially even though it's very complicated to analyze them because they are pretty large kind of conglomerates. It's hard to measure productivity in that sense. I would imagine they are also the main source of misallocation. The misallocation that was driven by kind of local SOEs, that's probably the one that's more easily to eliminate. In terms of the private firms, I do think that like over time, larger firms are winning out, mostly because of FIEs. What I wish we could do more with, and I'm not really sure how to get at that with the data, is, how much are the private domestic firms deterred from entry because they face, they don't have the same connections as the SOEs, so that like maybe in a sense, it's really the private ones that are not really benefiting. Like we showed you in the results that like it's the private domestic firms that are really not benefiting that much from the agreement. And it would be helpful to understand why they are not. We do know that they are the most financially constrained and so on, but it's really hard to observe firm-specific measures of those constraints.
Yeah. So we were almost out of time, but just to sort of push you a little bit on that, what I was sort of thinking about is the initial distribution, and see if it evolved differently in different industries. And a related question, and actually let me say totally separate question. So just answer this one. In some sense, you might think that the opportunity created productive capacity to export to the United States, but then that productive capacity got used to export to other markets. So do you see any of that kind of sequential entry of the largest firms into more markets?
Yeah, so one thing that we really wish we had, let me see where, I went too far, is we so wish we had custom level data from Vietnam. Unfortunately, like it kind of becomes readily available in 2010, but not earlier, because some of that would be, we would be able to then get, oops, am I? Some of that we would be then, we would be able to answer some of these questions that you have. I'm trying to look for a slide, but let me just give you a sense of that. I do think that this, this is the effect of the agreement on world, basically on world imports from Vietnam in response to, how they evolve in response to tariff cuts. And what you see here is on the left-hand side, we have US, like total world imports from Vietnam. And here on the right-hand side, we exclude US. And what you see is that the world imports from Vietnam are increasing over time. But you see that like initially, most of that increase is driven by US. And then in the second part of the sample, like it seems like, exports to the rest of the world are also increasing. So there definitely seem to be some sort of linkages there, right? That basically when the US opens up and FDI enters, like, well, they initially, they are exporting to Vietnam, to US, but then it seems like they also kind of like spillover effects to other markets. And we so wish, and maybe with like the limited custom level data we have that we could get from 2010 on, we could get at that. But it would be really, like, I agree with you. I think it would be really interesting to see kind of firm entry and entry on that export margin. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have one more question, Stella Rubinov, but please just put it in the chat. I think we need to develop a reputation of ending on time. We are Swiss after all. But I want to thank you, Nina, so much. This paper was exactly the kind of paper which links trade and development. You use good data to address real world questions. And like all good research projects, raises more questions than it answers, but does answer some of the questions. So thank you very much, Nina, from all of us here in Geneva.
Yeah, thank you so much for being such an active audience.
My pleasure. Next week is Paul Antras, same time, October 12th, starting at 1500 hours Geneva time. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.